There's a feeling that shows up the moment someone younger than you announces they're starting over. It isn't envy, not the kind you learned to call envy. It's something else, something underneath, that you learned to dress up as admiration before you'd even fully felt it. You smile, you call it brave, and you swallow, again, what you've never had the nerve to say out loud to yourself. It happened at a cookout, or a family dinner, one of those nights where everyone talks about their life like it's going fine by default. Someone mentioned they were switching careers, or going back to finish a degree they'd abandoned 15 years ago, or putting their savings into something new. You made the right face. You said it was brave. Something tightened inside you in a way you couldn't name at the time, and maybe still haven't. You've gotten good at making that face. Good enough that nobody at the table ever suspects what's happening under it. What you've been calling to old might never have been about age at all. You hit 40 carrying a list you never wrote down but know by heart every single day, without ever noticing how much it weighs. A version of life you assumed you'd have reached by now. A title, a relationship, a body, a bank account with some breathing room, a sense of having arrived somewhere solid. And when that list doesn't match what you actually have, something in you decides the problem is the clock, that your window closed, that anyone who starts over after 40 is an exception, a stroke of luck, or braver than you'll ever be. Maybe you've even said it out loud, half joking, half not, said your window's closed, that this stage belongs to younger people, that you already had your shot. And every time that sentence leaves your mouth, it sounds true because you've repeated it to yourself for so long you forgot you ever chose to believe it. But today you're going to hear something that might change how you carry this from here on. The fear you call being too old has a different origin than you think. And once that origin is named correctly, it loses a good part of the grip it's had on you. The first sign starts with a comparison you don't even notice making. You open your phone on some ordinary night and see someone, usually younger, announcing they've turned the page, moved cities, finished a degree they dropped, started a small business that's finally taking off. And the first thing that shows up inside you doesn't have a name yet. It arrives before the word does. It's a tightening, followed by an automatic, silent comparison you make without choosing to make it. You're comparing chapter 1 of someone else's life to chapter 20 of your own. She's at the beginning. You're somewhere in the middle, maybe closer to the end than you'd like to say out loud. And the problem isn't that she's further along. The problem is you're measuring two different clocks, as if they were the same clock. The start of one story never looks like the middle of another. Not because one is better than the other, but because they're different moments in different plots, written with different information, different losses, different weight on their backs. When you feel ashamed watching someone start over, it's rarely shame about your whole life. It's shame about a ruler you never chose, one that measures the opening of someone else's journey against the full accumulation of your own. And accumulation is heavy. Accumulation has kids to raise, bills to cover, a body that doesn't bounce back the way it used to, old decisions still collecting interest every month. Nobody wins by comparing chapter 1 to chapter 20. This was never about being behind. It was always about comparing things that were never meant to sit side by side. Nobody wins that comparison, not because chapter 20 is worse, but because it was never a fair fight to begin with. And there's a cruel detail in this that almost nobody notices. The app feeding you these stories was built to hand you exactly the prettiest beginnings, the most photogenic restarts, the best edited first steps. You never see that person's hard second month, their 3 in the morning doubt, the bill that almost didn't clear. You see the launch, the turn, the before and after already resolved. And you compare that against your entire unedited day, no cuts, no soundtrack behind it. And until you see this clearly, you're going to keep feeling like you're losing a race that was never yours to run. There's a version of this you might know even better. You run into an old coworker after years apart, someone who left a stable job to try something different, and they're visibly lighter, more alive, telling the story with a spark you haven't felt in a while. The question that rises in you isn't whether they're happy, it's whether you'd have had the nerve to do the same thing. And since you already know the answer you usually give yourself, the conversation ends and the tightness stays, even after you've changed the subject. But there's a question hiding behind that comparison, and what it reveals is harder to sit with than the comparison itself. The second thing that changes when the fear loses its grip has to do with a word you've probably never used to describe what you feel. The word is grief. You're not too old. You're grieving, and nobody ever taught you the difference. There's a particular flavor to this you might recognize instantly. It's the quiet count you do, almost without meaning to, whenever you meet someone your age who seems to have it all locked in. The stable job, the settled home, the sense of having landed. You do the math in seconds. Where they are, where you are, how far off track you feel by comparison. Nobody taught you to run that math. You just started doing it one day and never stopped. Grieving a life you pictured having by 40 and didn't get. The marriage that was supposed to be steadier by now. The title that was supposed to have arrived years ago. The body that was supposed to have held its shape. The account that was supposed to have some slack in it. The feeling, hard to admit even to yourself, of having landed somewhere less solid than where you thought you'd be. Nobody taught you to name that loss as loss. They taught you to call it failure, to call it being behind, to call it too old for certain things. But what you feel when you look back and see the distance between what you imagined and what you lived isn't about age. It's grief for a future you sketched without knowing you were sketching a promise life never owed you. Maybe the quietest grief of all is for a relationship you pictured closer than it turned out to be. It doesn't have to have ended. It can be standing, functioning, splitting bills and holidays, and still carry inside you the sense that something you can't quite name never showed up. That's grief, too. Grief for a closeness you expected to have built by now that somehow got lost along the way, between routine, exhaustion, and years that moved faster than you noticed the distance, growing. And grief has one thing a sentence doesn't. Grief can be processed. A sentence, you just serve. Treat this like a sentence and you'll spend your time waiting to accept a loss. Treat it like grief and you processed. Feel eating fool, then they manage something else in its place. Seneca wrote, more than 2,000 years ago, that life isn't short. We just waste a great deal of it without noticing we're wasting it. It isn't the time you have left that's holding you back. It's the time you've already spent trying not to feel this loss, pretending it isn't there, calling it age when it was always unprocessed grief. Think of a recent birthday, one of those where, in the middle of the party, in the middle of the singing, something in you went quiet, running the distance between where you are and where you thought you'd be. Nobody noticed, because you smiled at the right moment, blew out the candle at the right moment. But after everyone left, that math kept running on its own, no audience, just you and the list of things that still hadn't happened. And while that pain stays unnamed, it keeps disguising itself as several other things, including shame in front of people who know you as successful. The third thing that loses its grip is exactly that. The shame of starting over in front of the people who watched you become someone established. That imaginary audience that always seems to be watching, ready to catch you if you stumble, ready to remember who you were before you decided to change direction. If you've watched this channel's video about people who drain your energy without saying a word, you'll recognize this mechanism from a different angle now, because that audience you imagine judging you doesn't just live outside you, it lives inside you, and sometimes it's far less forgiving than any real person would ever be. The uncomfortable truth is that audience almost never exists the way you picture it. The people you're afraid of disappointing are, most of the time, too busy with their own unwritten lists to really notice yours. And even when they do notice, their judgment doesn't carry the weight you handed it over the years. Most people are not watching you nearly as closely as your fear insists. They are, at this exact moment, running their own private math, worrying about their own unfinished list, rehearsing their own version of this same fear. Epictetus said what others think of us lies outside our control, and that living bound to that judgment is handing the reins of your own life to someone who isn't even holding them on purpose. That distinction between what depends on you and what doesn't was for him the foundation of any real peace. You don't get to choose what others think of you. You do get to choose whether you'll live as a hostage to it for the rest of your days. Picture that relative or that old friend you imagine gossiping behind your back if you changed your life now. Notice something. You've never actually heard that person say it. You built the whole line yourself, gave it a voice, gave it weight, and then spent years fearing a sentence nobody ever spoke. The harshest audience you face every day isn't sitting in your family's living room. It's sitting inside your own head, holding a microphone you handed it yourself. When you understand that this imaginary audience will never actually applaud you or punish you, because it only exists inside your own head, something in it loses its grip. It doesn't vanish all at once, but it stops having the final word in your decisions. And there's an even bigger confusion behind all of this. One most people carry their whole lives without ever noticing they're carrying it. The fourth thing that shifts is the quietest of all. You separate the idea of starting over from the idea of admitting you were wrong. Because underneath it all, the fear of starting over after 40 is almost never about the restart itself. It's about what it seems to confess in public. Changing course seems to say, in front of everyone who watched your earlier choice, that the choice was wrong from the start. That you spent years, effort, money, an entire identity on a direction you're now walking away from. Starting over isn't confessing a mistake, a choice that made complete sense 15 years ago, with the information you had then, as the person you were then, can stop making sense today. And that doesn't erase the value it had the moment it was made. You weren't wrong back then. You're different now. Those are two very different things. But a frightened mind loves to blur them together to keep you standing still. Picture the exact moment you tell your family you're changing direction. The table's set, faces turning toward you, the 1 second of silence before someone asks, why? That second of silence is what you fear most, far more than the restart itself. But notice that fear is about their imagined reaction, not the change itself. You've already decided, underneath it, that the change makes sense. What's missing is the nerve to sit through 1 second of silence. At a table, think of someone you know who changed direction after 40. Chances are, deep down, you never thought that person was confessing a failure. You thought they had courage. The harsh judgment you fear receiving is the same judgment you rarely apply when you watch someone else do the exact thing you're afraid to do. Starting over isn't confessing a mistake. It's recognizing that whoever decides today has information whoever decided yesterday simply didn't have. That's not betrayal of your past self. That's respect for how much you've actually learned since then. And what's left once that confusion clears is a very different question than the one you'd been asking yourself. The fifth and last thing that happens when the fear loses its grip is a shift in focus that seems small but changes almost everything. You understand that the time you have left is more real than the time that's already gone. Not because the past stops mattering. It matters. It shaped you. It carries the scars that make sense of your choices today. But the past is no longer a territory you can act in. It only exists to be remembered, revisited, sometimes grieved quietly. The only territory where you still hold any real power is what's left. And what's left, at 40, is still an enormous amount of time, even when it doesn't feel that way on the day you're comparing your life to someone younger. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in the early hours while running an entire empire about the importance of acting with the time we still have instead of spending it mourning what's already gone. He didn't write that as easy optimism. He wrote it as daily discipline because he knew, better than most, that the human mind prefers replaying what's past to acting on what can still change. You're not getting the last 20 years back. Nobody does. But you don't need to, because the math was never about how much time is gone. It was always about what you can still do with what's left. And what's left, even after a whole life has crossed the halfway point, is still enough to build something worth carrying to the end. If you're 40 today, you still have, on average, more than half of your adult life ahead of you. Enough time to learn an entire new trade from scratch, to build a different kind of relationship than the one you had, to write the book you never wrote, to rebuild a body, an account, a whole routine. More than once if it comes to that. The problem was never a lack of time. It was spending the time that's passed trying to prove it shouldn't have passed that way. Ask yourself honestly how much of what you call not enough time is actually just fear wearing a calendar as a disguise. Time, at 40, is still generous. Fear is what makes it feel small. Think of how many times, in the last few months, you put something off telling yourself you'd start next week, next month, at the start of next year. Each of those postponements felt harmless at the time. Together, they make up most of the time you feel like you're missing now. It wasn't age that used up that time. It was waiting for a perfect moment that was never going to arrive. Because a perfect moment is just another way of saying never. The fear you felt at that cookout, listening to someone younger announce a fresh start, was never about their age or yours. It was grief disguised as a sentence. It was comparing clocks that were never meant to sit side by side. It was an imaginary audience you built and set up yourself. It was confusing a change of direction with confessing a mistake you never made. And underneath all of it, it was fear of looking at the time you have left and finding out it still asks something of you. Maybe you close this video and go back to your routine exactly as it was before you hit play. The dishes will still be in the sink. Work will still start at the same time tomorrow. Nobody will notice any visible change in you, but inside, something is already different. You know now that what you felt was never about being too old. It was about a pain that never had a proper name. And a named pain no longer carries the weight it had when it was just an unexplained ache. If any of this reached you, you don't need to answer to me. Answer to yourself, right here in the comments, without worrying who's going to read it. What did you picture having by 40 that you still don't have? Write it. No shame attached. No name need explanation. Just the sentence. However it comes to you. Marcus Aurelius left himself an instruction that crossed 2,000 years to land at this exact moment. Stop waiting to live inside some imagined perfect republic and be content taking one more step forward, without counting that single step as small.